Hello and welcome back to the JavaScript training. In this section, we're going to cover cross-domain development and how we can run and execute JavaScript across multiple domains. So cross-domain development. So suppose we have two websites, x.com and y.com. Now, y.com wants to include some functionality from x.com. We could definitely open up some APIs on x.com and use JavaScript to interact, but consider the following. What if x.com asks for customer login credentials and they don't want y.com to have access to them? What if y.com doesn't want x.com to negatively affect their site in any way? Y.com essentially wants the x.com functionality to be sandboxed. So how can we cover these scenarios? So we can cover these scenarios by isolating our functionality into an iframe or a pop-up, so that any credentials that are entered in the iframe are actually entered on x.com and y.com has no access to that information. Also, updates to x.com functionality within the iframe would only break the functionality on x.com, would not break the core functionality of y.com. So this sounds pretty awesome, right? So why haven't we been doing this forever? So it turns out that communicating between iframes and pop-up windows is really difficult. The only option we have available doesn't do a great job of doing things in a modern JavaScript way, which we'll see in our exercise to come. So does anyone know how we can communicate with iframes and pop-ups on different domains using JavaScript? So we can use the function window.postMessage to communicate between windows on different domains. It's really the only option that we have. So we're going to go over the actual documentation for the window.postMessage function. All right, so this is the main documentation for postMessage on the Mozilla Developer Network. You'll see that postMessage is a function that's attached on the window object. So the window object is a global object in JavaScript. It's always available, so postMessage is always there. So you'll see the syntax here is just some window, you're post-messaging, calling the function, and you're sending a message and a target origin. For the sake of this training, that's all we're going to concentrate on. There are some other options that are available in the transfer, but we're not going to go over that. So to send a basic message, all you do is you say, hey window, here's a message and here's the target origin. So then on the actual window itself, whatever's in the iframe or the pop-up, we also have to be listening for the message. And how we do that, we use the add event listener function that's also on the window. We listen for a special event called message, in which we actually receive the event, and then the false is the third argument, which is a reference to the window object. For this training, we're just going to put false in there. So it's important to note that every single time you do a post message, this is the actual event that you're listening for. It's called message. So even if another website was using post message, it would all come through in this one event listener. There's no sort of multiple event listeners for a post message. So you see their receive message function here is just taking the event and then checking the origin to make sure that it's example org, and then returning. So that's kind of how we can listen for the event in the iframe or the pop-up window. All right, so what are some concerns? So one major limitation of postMessage is that you can only send strings as messages. So when you're actually using postMessage to send the message, the actual message itself has to be a string. So knowing this, how can we message a JavaScript object between domains? So there's a nifty function on the JSON global object called stringify, where you can pass it a JavaScript object and it will turn that object into a string. Then we can also use json.parse to return that string back into an object on the listener. One thing about json.stringify is if a property is a function, it's not going to stringify it because you can't stringify a function. It just won't include that property when you're actually messaging it. So how is this kind of secure as far as this whole post message stuff goes? So post message can be secured if used properly. You should always specify the target domain when sending messages and always verify the origin and source of the received messages. For this training, we're not going to be concerned about security. We're just going to simply be posting messages and listening for messages. So the setup. So in a normal post message setup, you're going to have 4 parts. You're going to have the parent, which sends the message. You're going to have the parent listening for messages from the child, and in this case, like a confirmation saying, hey, I received the message that you sent. You're going to have the child, which is the iframe. You're going to have that listening for the message from the parent, and then you're also going to have the child send some sort of a confirmation saying, yeah, I received the message. So on the event listener, you're going to get an actual event, which looks similar to the image here on the right. And for this training, we're only going to be concerned with the data property. You'll notice that the data property is actually a string, but it's a string of a JavaScript object that we actually use stringify to create. So the following diagram demonstrates this post message interaction. So you start with a parent or sender, and you also have a child iframe, which we're going to say is a receiver. So right when the parent loads, the parent is going to wait for the iframe to be loaded, but it's also going to set the add event listener for message because we want to start this post message integration. So once the actual iframe is loaded, the child iframe is going to add an event listener, same as the parent, to listen for messages from the parent. So once the actual iframe is loaded, we're going to JSON stringify the message. Then we're going to use window.postMessage, which is going to send an event to the child iframe, where the child iframe is already listening for it. Once the message is received, we can update the DOM. We can really do anything we want. For this example, we're just going to update the DOM or some input value. And then our child is going to post message back to the parent, which is already listening, saying, hey, yeah, I got that message. And then the parent can really do whatever it wants. It knows that the child received the message and everything is good to go. All right, so that sums up the actual description of cross-domain communication and post message. The next video is going to be an exercise where we will go over the cross-domain development and post message in an actual example.